Try not to worry about it, Morty. You're a good kid. And there's not a premium on that right now, but you'll be getting girls sometime after Brad's out of shape.
You're missing the point, Dad. I don't want girls. I want Jessica.
Well, I remember feeling that way about a young lady named your mom, and that's not an urban diss. Your mom was my Jessica. I remember the first time I saw her. I thought...
I should get her pregnant, and then she'll have to marry me.
I beg your pardon, Rick. Inappropriate.
Sorry, please proceed with your story about banging my daughter in high school. I'm not sure you want to take romantic advice from this guy, Morty. His marriage is hanging from a thread.
My marriage is fine, thank you.
Jerry, it's your house. Whatever you say it is how it is, but I think a blind man could see that Beth is looking for the door. I barely have a reason to care, and even I notice. Come on, Rick. Don't talk about my parents like that. Listen, Morty, I hate to break it to you, but what people call love is just a chemical reaction that compels animals to breed. It hits hard, Morty, then it slowly fades, leaving you stranded in a failing marriage. I did it. Your parents are gonna do it. Break the cycle, Morty. Rise above. Focus on science. All right, well, I'm gonna go get dressed for the dance.
Yeah, I'm just going to check on your mom.
Everyone in the universe is a hero. All you have to do is know the difference between good and bad and root for good.
Rick says good and bad are artificial constructs.
Yeah, well, I get the feeling he kind of needs that to be the case.
All right, let me give a little bit of an introduction to evolutionary debunking arguments. Does evolution debunk moral realism? So this is another argument that pops up in meta-ethical debates over objectivity, universality, and moral realism. And it's an argument against objectivity or universality. It's an argument against moral realism. So if you're familiar with the show Rick and Morty, at all, you probably know that Rick is very skeptical of morality. He's also very skeptical of altruistic and other regarding emotions most of the time. So he famously remarks that love is just a chemical reaction that compels animals to breed. In other words, he gives this evolutionary account of love. It's not some, romantic love is basically a fiction. It's not like you're finding your long lost soulmate or anything like that. That's a feeling we project on people because it had an evolutionary advantage, right? So he says it hits hard, then it slowly fades, leaving you stranded in a failing marriage. I did it. Your parents are going to do it. Break the cycle, rise above, focus on science, right? And then in other episodes of Rick and Morty, either Rick says or Morty says on Rick's behalf that, good and bad, right and wrong, these are artificial constructions, right? So Rick expresses pretty regularly morally skeptical, egoistic, and anti-realist views. He doesn't think that morality is real. It's moral anti-realism. This is very close to what contemporary philosophers call the evolutionary debunking argument. And there are a couple different versions of this, of course, and we'll just look at a couple simple ones here. And so just to give you an example, Michael Ruse is a contemporary philosopher who argues in this manner in an interview that he gave in it was a podcast and also turned into a book called Very Bad Wizards that you can find wherever you like to get your podcasts. It's widely available. In the interviewer, he are talking about his view of morality as an illusion, and the interviewer asks, so it's an illusion. So then you're saying that the only true connection is that Darwinianism, evolution, can account for why we falsely believe that ethics is real. And he says, well, no, I distinguish normative ethics from meta-ethics. In normative ethics, I think evolution can go a long way to explain our feelings of obligation. Be just, be fair, treat others like yourself. In fact, just as a little aside here to break off from the quote for a second, Darwin in Descent of Man thought that evolution supported the social instincts and basically supported the golden rule. Have Ruse here saying something very similar. He says, we humans are social animals, and we need these sentiments to go on. I like Rawls' thinking on this on about page 500 of his Theory of Justice. It's a very large book. Rawls says he thinks the social contract was put in place by evolution rather than by a group of old men years ago. Then in meta-ethics, I think we see that morality is an adaptation merely and hence has no justification. Having said this, I agree with the philosopher J.L. Mackie, who influenced me a lot, that we feel that we have to objectify ethics. If we did not think of that our ethics was objective, if we didn't think our ethics was objective, it would collapse under cheating. So remember, Mackey is a proponent of error theory. The error in error theory is the mistaken presumption that moral statements express genuine propositions that could be true or false, but they're all false. They have a claim to objectivity that's false. It was Mackey's position, and here Ruse is espousing that on the basis of the evolutionary debunking argument. In a similar vein, Joshua Green, in an article that you can find called From Neural Is to Moral Ought, he gives this account, neurological account of moral judgment, and neuroscientists have discovered basically two different, broadly speaking, mechanisms. One that's quick and intuitive and unreflective, and then another one that's slower and more deliberate for making moral judgments. And so these are evolved capacities in our brain, right? This is what we're actually doing when we make these so-called moral judgments. It's what neuroscientists study with regard to ethics. And so Green says, we have here the beginnings of a debunking explanation of moral realism. We believe in moral realism because moral experience has perceptual phenomenology, and the moral experience has a perceptual phenomenology because natural selection has outfitted us with mechanisms for making intuitive, emotion-based moral judgments, much as it had outfitted us with the mechanisms for making intuitive, emotion-based judgments about who among us are most suitable mates. Therefore, we can understand our inclination towards moral realism not as an insight into the nature of moral truth, but as a byproduct of the efficient cognitive processes we use to make moral decisions. According to this view, moral realism is akin to naive realism about sexiness, like making the understandable mistake of thinking that Tom Cruise is objectively sexier than his baboon counterparts. So, from these sorts of considerations, we could put together we could ask if, suppose for the sake of argument, just practicing debates and analyzing arguments, suppose for the sake of argument that Singer's objection is correct and that there are some moral principles that seem to be the product of rational insight rather than a product of evolution. Which premise in this argument would that most directly attack? All right, there is a little bit about the evolutionary debunking argument. So again, just trying to provide a brief overview of some of the big ideas you'll be digging into in more detail as you go through the readings and we discuss these in class. So this comes from Peter Singer, also from Very Bad Wizards, the interview there. So he says, Peter Singer's a utilitarian, and here's what he says about evolutionary debunking. He says, but we could argue that this is too swift. You can distinguish between intuitions that have evolved in the manner I just suggested and intuitions that haven't. The former is not likely to be truth tracking, but consider the intuition supporting Sedgwick's axiom of rational benevolence that requires us to be impartial across different people. It's very hard to see how that intuition could have conferred any evolutionary advantage. That intuition is therefore unlikely to be likely to be a rational insight into moral truth. In other words, he's saying that when it comes to that particular principle of rational benevolence, it looks like it resists evolutionary debunking. And so perhaps it's an example of something that's actually true and independent of human belief and practice. In other words, not just the product of evolution. So if we go back to our argument, we could ask if, suppose for the sake of argument, just practicing debates and analyzing arguments, suppose for the sake of argument that Singer's objection is correct and that there are some moral principles that seem to be the product of rational insight rather than a product of evolution. Which premise in this argument would that most directly attack? All right, there is a little bit about the evolutionary debunking argument. So again, just trying to provide a brief overview of some of the big ideas you'll be digging into in more detail as you go through the readings and we discuss these in class.